What exactly does net zero mean?
GHG, greenhouse gas emissions.
In the name of growth, we have also kind of damaged the environment a bit. And
Net zero. It's not real zero. There is still carbon in the atmosphere. There are markets where you can trade for credits.
what are the career opportunities in this domain of ESG, like for the youngsters?
And the first thing is information. If you don't know what your impact is, there is no way you can reduce it.
Hey guys, welcome to Better Engineering and Management podcast. Today we have my friend Sam Mathew joining us to discuss the goals and opportunities in ESG. How can we live sustainably on this planet? Sam has extensive experience in the energy industry and he is passionate about driving sustainable innovation and transformation in the energy sector. He is currently serving as the UK industry lead for energy and utilities at Microsoft. Sam, please welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thanks for having me. I mean, super interesting what you're doing here. So, really thankful and grateful that I can be involved. Look forward to the conversation.
Sam, the first question that I wanted to start with is what exactly does net zero mean? Why is it important in today's world? And how do various companies report on the key metrics here?
Yeah, great question to start off with. I think before we get into net zero, might be good to start off by just defining one of the basic concepts, which is GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, and why that is important. So, greenhouse gases emissions are basically gases that are released into the Earth's atmosphere and which trap heat and which effectively then contribute to what's called the greenhouse effect, warming of the planet. And greenhouse gases can be things like carbon dioxide, they can be methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of greenhouse gases. Now, what these gases do is, like I said, they eventually lead to warming up of the planet because they trap heat. And our activities or human activities have significantly increased the amount of greenhouse gas concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere ever since the Industrial Revolution. So that is sort of the starting point for all of this. We got a planet that's warming up, and eventually what that may lead to is destruction of biodiversity. It'll lead to rising sea levels. It'll lead to other such irreversible damage, which will just threaten human population and biodiversity on the planet. So that's the sort of starting concept. Now, like we say, all of our activities lead to increase of these greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. So it's mainly driven post the Industrial Revolution, once we've started sort of doing activities which have effectively led to the sort of development that we see in the world and across the planet today. So what are organizations supposed to do, or what do we want organizations to do? First of all, we want organizations to really understand what's their impact on the planet. So all the activities that an organization does has a certain level of impact on the planet, which can be sort of at the end of the day seen in terms of emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So when I say emissions, I'm meaning greenhouse gas emissions as a whole. So I'm using the terms interchangeably. So you want organizations to understand their emissions, but understanding is the first step. You want organizations to then take steps to either completely eliminate their emissions or reduce it to the extent possible. Now, this is where the concept of net zero comes in. So net zero doesn't mean zero, doesn't mean real zero, doesn't mean there are no emissions. It just basically means that you're balancing the amount of gases or emissions which come out from an organization's operations, and you balance that with the amount of emissions that it removes from the organization. So, example, a company has a certain level of emissions that are produced through its actual operations and through all that it does as an organization. Now, what it can do is it can try to reduce that to the extent possible. But in some cases, what you then also do is you tend to balance out, you tend to negate the remaining emissions. And the way you do that is by offsetting them, this concept of offset. And this is where things like carbon credits come in. So what that basically means is you will then get projects, or you'll then get measures to offset the rest of your emissions. So you've got a certain set of emissions, you try to reduce it to the extent possible, and for what you cannot reduce or remove, you then do offsetting mechanisms. There are different ways of offsetting, and we can go into that, but the way then companies will then report these emissions out to the world and to their investors and so on is through typically their ESG reports, their environmental, social, and governance reports. These are generally part of the annual reports or standalone reports. Some companies also have what they call sustainability reports. So again, in there you will find a whole bunch of data and information regarding to a company's emissions and its impact on the environment. But within there, some of the key metrics to call out will be what's called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So scope 1 emissions are emissions that are occurring because of a company's direct, operations, or which are called direct emissions. So these are things that the organization can control. So if you think about it, you've got a manufacturing plant, right? And as part of that manufacturing, they've got some machinery that runs. These are things that the company can control. So the emissions that come from running those machinery, which might be running on carbon-based fuels, is something that the company can control. So that's scope 1 emissions, which is direct emission. Scope 2 emissions is what's called indirect emissions. Every organization will be buying things like electricity and other utilities for offices, for their plants, and so on and so forth. So the emissions that come from from these utilities that they are buying are typically what's called indirect emissions or scope 2 emissions. And scope 3 emissions are basically indirect emissions in their value chain. So, for example, you've got a manufacturing organization, again, going back to that example, that creates, say, some products. Emissions that come from use of those products are scope 3 emissions. So, in any good ESG reporting or any good sustainability reporting from an organization, you'll find these sort of metrics. And apart from this, there might be other things like offsets they've used and what's the target to net zero, what's their journey to net zero, and so on and so forth. So, so we've covered probably a few things there, but I'd say the basic thing starts with emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and understanding what an organization is doing, reporting it through key metrics like scope 1, 2, and 3. And typically you tend to see them in ESG or annual reporting.
Very interesting. I think a couple of important points I've noted here is like one is like you mentioned that all this manufacturing, particularly after industrial era, right? Since all this manufacturing started in the name of growth, we have also kind of damaged the environment a bit and kind of because of this greenhouse gases. I think the main scary things are those points which are irreversible because there are damages which are also irreversible, which probably we cannot do anything, but we should be very cautious about emissions at least. I think as you mentioned, you have to do some positive things to negate the impact of emissions, and all people who are interested in these kind of measurements, like if they want to know how companies are reporting, they can go to sustainability reports and ESG reports where they will be describing the scope 1 and all those emissions. Very interesting. I think you also touched on the point of carbon credits. I think it would be interesting to go deeper into that because it's a lot talked about. So can you explain like how does carbon credits work and how does it ensure balance?
Absolutely. So again, sort of carbon credits, the whole point of carbon credit sort of comes in when we talk net zero, when a company is trying to, or when an organization is trying to balance the actual emissions it produces against certain balancing mechanisms. And one of them is carbon credits. So what is a carbon credit? A carbon credit basically it represents 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent greenhouse gas emissions that has been reduced or removed or avoided. So you're getting a credit for avoiding a ton or reducing a ton or removing a ton of CO2 or a similar type of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a credit. So, and in this, like I said, there's probably 2 main categories. One is removal. So the carbon is there, you're removing it. Or the other bit is the avoidance or the complete reduction of it. So it never comes into the atmosphere in the first place. So the first one is removal. It comes into the atmosphere and is removed. Second one, it never even comes. So what are the kind of things or the activities that actually reduce or remove carbon from the atmosphere? So these might be things like, so you can start with, so for the removal bit, you can have projects. So today you might have heard of direct air capture, which is basically capturing free carbon, captures carbon dioxide, removes carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through various different technologies, and then converts that into, say, solid carbon, for example. So you've taken carbon out from the atmosphere. So that's an example of a removal sort of activity. And
Right.
avoidance or a reduction activity might be, building trees
Okay.
and making sure that you are basically, or what's called afforestation. You've got green lands, or you got forests or trees, which are basically, again, their effect is to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere. They're basically sort of reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere through the use of CO2 and photosynthesis and so on and so forth.
Sure.
Another might be protecting forests or greenlands. So if there are agencies that are working to protect forests or greenlands, then that's an example of how you sort of reduce and remove emissions. So what
Okay.
happens basically is an organization will first look at its impact on the environment, on the atmosphere, basically calculate its emissions. And to the extent possible, it will try and reduce its emissions. And for the remainder of those emissions, it will then get carbon credits. So I might have a certain level of impact in terms of carbon that still is in the atmosphere because of my operations. I'll then go out and buy carbon credits to match those. So what I'm doing is I'm effectively netting it out, and hence the term net zero. It's not real zero. There is still carbon in the
Right.
atmosphere, but then there is a
Right.
netting impact because I've then
Okay.
either got the credits for it, or I made sure that someone else on the planet is doing
Okay.
activities that basically abate it.
Basically, I'm supporting those people who are kind of helping the planet and for using carbon credits, even if I'm not
Correct.
able to kind of reduce my activities or emissions directly. Okay.
Correct, correct. And the thing to remember here is carbon credits are a tricky sort of concept at the best of times. And the reason I say that is because you need to have really good certificates that back up these carbon credits, because, I mean, otherwise you could end up using, you can end up double counting it or triple counting it. You can take the credit for the same patch of Greenland, and you could sell like thousands of certificates for that, and each of them could be claiming credit,
Right.
but at the end of the day there's only a finite portion there, and it
Right.
can't really support all of those credits. So this is where there's a lot of work that goes on into making sure that the
Mhm.
certificates that you get are from really good, authentic, reputable organizations that can back it up to say that you're actually. Otherwise it's just smoke and mirrors, like
Right. Understood.
it's like an accounting
Sh-
fraud, if you
Fraud,
may.
basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, understood. So basically, what I understand is that you try to reduce your carbon imprint as much as possible, and for what you can't, you can buy carbon credits where you are indirectly helping the planet by helping those people who are planting more trees or protecting the green lands and all those things. And just like any other currency, right, carbon credits has its own
Yeah.
you know points where someone can double count it by kind of taking the same credit twice for the same thing, same activity. So regulation is important here. The measurement is very important, and I believe the agencies which are doing this must be kind of becoming better and better at it, maybe using technology or whatever,
Yeah,
so that they.
absolutely.
But just
Absolutely.
one question around it, like where do you get these carbon credits, and is it like a common currency that used right now today, or there are some other alternatives to it?
So there are markets where you can trade for credits. Like you can buy those credits. There are organizations through which you can access the carbon markets and buy credits. So it's like any other sort of tradable and purchasable entity. You can buy them. And for me, I think, yeah, the real important bit is making sure that whenever you get into the space, it is with partners or with organizations that are really of good reputation, because otherwise, I mean, you just risk your own corporate reputation. But apart from that, I think the real important bit is that while in your sort of system and in your belief you are sort of having a net zero impact on the planet, that isn't really true. There is massive impact on the planet, and in this case, I think there is responsibility from all of us needed, because, I mean, there is no planet B, right? This is it.
Understood.
I mean, and then we need to make sure that we
I think
get it right.
the point that is coming out, just because you can buy carbon credits doesn't mean your responsibility is over. I
Correct,
mean,
correct.
it's not like you can trade your responsibility for money. You should do as much as possible to kind of
Exactly.
control your own
Exactly. Don't,
activities.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly that. Don't make it someone else's problem, basically, right? These emissions or this footprint is because of what you do at an organization level. And we can bring it right down to an individual level as well, right? The way
right,
we all live, we all have a certain footprint and impact on the planet.
right,
So
right,
the first step is always to reduce it. Reduce our impact to the extent possible, eliminate it if you can, which in most cases is not possible, but reduce it to the extent you can. And then after that, try and sort of match and sort of net it out. I mean, at an individual level, for example, every time we buy a flight ticket, there is a category in those add-ons, right? There is a category around offsetting your carbon emissions
right.
from that flight journey that you take. Do we actually sort of support that? Because that is how you can do that at an individual level, how you can go net zero or how you can support net zero at an individual level. Because there are commercially available electrical or electric airplanes are still not quite there yet. So you have to take a plane that uses high carbon fuel. Like that's the reality of life. It's a hydrocarbon based fuel that flight uses. So you can't avoid that maybe. But what you can do is probably offset your emissions from that flight. And that's net zero
Right.
at an individual level, if you know.
I think as an individual, we should be kind of cognizant of what are various provisions which are present. Because good that you mentioned about this. In fact, nowadays, what I have observed is anytime you do kind of e-commerce shopping or something like that, there will also be a secondary checkbox where you can donate a very small portion, like $1 or a couple of cents, to some kind of organizations which are helping nature. I don't know how true that would be generally, but assuming, I mean, from your own kind of you can develop this perspective that if I can donate a little bit of help here and there, it would be good. And now that you mentioned it, yesterday I got an email from one of the products that I use, Canva, basically, where they have mentioned that they have planted some millions of trees. I had not kind of did any research on it, but it's a good thing because people are using some kind of software, and those software platforms are helping plantation of trees. What's better than that? I mean, I felt very good after reading that email,
No,
and just to
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, so a couple of points there. I think first one is, as a responsible consumer, we should always be asking organizations where we think it's necessary for their backup or their certificates for that, because you can't just claim you sort of planted so many trees. I mean, this is not specific to the example you mentioned, but I guess at times we should also challenge organizations and see where is the certificate or where is the authenticity that backs that claim. The other thing I'd mention is, as individuals, one of the things that, like, one of the biggest roles that we can play is as investors. I mean, we've got massive investment sort of capacity, right, as individuals. So let's put that to good
right.
use. So, like I mentioned, direct air capture, where, physically the carbon is being captured from the atmosphere and being converted into solid carbon or whatever. There's a whole bunch of startups in that space working on technology. So we might invest in those startups. We might invest in, say, renewable energy projects, for example, clean energy projects. So I think there is a lot. So one aspect is, like I mentioned, you can donate. You can make sure that you are paying for, well, not paying, but you are sort of supporting organizations that are doing the right thing. The second thing is, you can also make sure that you can be commercially savvy and make sure that your investment is into such organizations that are actually accelerating the transition for all of us. And at the end of the day, most countries across the world have got really good tax breaks and tax options when you invest in such clean energy or green projects. So again, you can be really commercially savvy about it.
Very interesting. So moving on, another question that I had in my mind is like, with countries like USA pulling out of the Paris Treaty, how much responsibility do you see various leaders sharing for sustainable energy goals?
No, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think might help if I sort of take us back a little bit, right? So the whole United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC, which is basically a legal and institutional foundation that countries across the planet sort of put together back in 1992. So this came around with its mission of reducing greenhouse gas concentrations from the atmosphere. Or back then it was first about stabilizing, and over time they've sort of started to work on reducing it. So that started back in 1992, and then part of that they created what's called COP, and you mentioned the Paris Agreement. So COP was basically the conference of parties, and it's an annual sort of meeting that happens every year, where again most of the countries in the planet come together. And this has been going on for I think since about 1993. And then the first real agreement was 1997 in what's called the Kyoto Protocol, and then Paris Agreement in 2015. Those were sort of some landmark agreements, 2015 being the real big one, where countries agreed to what's called the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, where each country was sort of committing to how they'll reduce their emissions. And the whole point is, we want to remove GHGs such that we maintain the temperature of the planet to below 2 degrees as compared to pre-industrial eras. Because beyond 2 degrees, the data basically shows that there is irreversible damage, and there's some real crazy things that are going to happen. While 2 degrees is the sort of starting point, the real aspiration is to try to get it to somewhere around 1.5 degrees. Even with 1.5 degrees, there'll be major sort of changes across the planet, some of which will be irreversible. But we believe at 1.5 degrees or thereabouts, we'll still be able to maintain the planet something similar to what it is today. So this is where, you talk about the US sort of, pulling out, and then with the first Trump administration, the US sort of walked out, or pulled out of the Paris Treaty, and then with the Biden administration, they came back in. There's again talk about them going back out. But I mean, be that as it may, I think even with or without the US, I mean, obviously with the US, there's a massive, massive sort of portion that countries can address. But I think, leaving that to one side, I think each country has got its own journey to address. And that is, in a way, I'd say slightly disconnected to another country's journey. So I think the COP is still there. In fact, US is still part of the COP for the time being. So I think countries should still focus on getting as much of the greenhouse gas and emissions reduced to the extent possible. And this is where, again, I think there is an individual contribution that each of us can do. And that's around, using our other big power, which is around voting. Like, let's try and understand which leaders, which political parties, which governments are really supporting this journey of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And let's really use our votes, use our power for that change. Because at the end of the day, we can't give the excuse of one country or one of the major countries pulling out of that agreement as a reason for all of us kind of, going and doing our own things. We still have got to play a responsible role. And I think as individuals, we come down to, the power of our voting and using that in the most, smartest manner.
I think it's very important thing you mentioned that every country has its own journey here. So let's leave it on the residents of USA to decide what they want for their future and what kind of governments they want, basically, or who would support these causes or not, and let them do some research on their own, like whether it's good for their own country or not. Forget the planet, as you mentioned, right? On a country level, also there is an impact of it. I hope most of the US people would be aligned with this fact that, nature is important, reducing these emissions is important, net zero principles are important, and moving forward, those politicians and will kind of take cognizance of it. As you mentioned, right? People can use their voting rights to assert these things directly or indirectly. And also you mentioned that even if US is not there, doesn't change anything because most of the other countries are still there, and this convention is happening annually. There are a lot of objectives which are being framed. If all the other countries kind of meet them, the impact would still be huge. Interesting. Just one more question on the same line. Like, how can we, like normal people, like who don't really have the vocabulary of ESG and all these, things, how can we keep ourselves aware with various important decisions and metrics regarding ESG? Like, where can they start learning about these topics, concepts, and understand these terminologies and various reports that are being published, right? Because it can also be very technical at certain point of times.
Yeah, I think, the first step to start is just by looking, or I would say I would recommend anyone looking into this to start researching about COP and the UNFCCC to kind of really understand the history of how some of this started. Because I think that is at a global level and at an individual country level that will give you an idea of what we've been doing. Why did this thing become really important? Like, we've been having this conversation in a very, very determined manner for the last 30, 40 years. And obviously this was there before that. I'm not saying it only came out in the 90s, but in the 90s is when we as a globe started to put some really good consolidated actions behind this conversation of emissions and the impact of emissions on the planet. And that was through the UNFCCC and the COP sort of mechanisms. So I would recommend everyone to have a look at that. The other thing so that's sort of one point. The other thing I'd probably recommend is looking at the sustainability or ESG reporting for your own company. Look at that for the company that you work for. Look at that for the companies that you invest in. Or look at that for some of the companies that you think are really doing some responsible actions in this area. So, try and look at the whole spectrum, because there might be companies that you believe are doing some great work in this area. Look at their reports. There are companies that you might feel are not doing great work in this area. Look at their reports and cross compare and see. And again, today we don't need to sit and manually do all of that, right? You've got co-pilots and AI tools that can help you do all of that. So I would say that's the other thing, is kind of look at that and try and understand what are responsible organizations doing, how are they reporting, the level to which they're reporting, and compare that with sort of other organizations, right? And look at your own company's reports. This is something that, makes us all responsible citizens. So that's sort of number two is, just look at ESG reporting. There is a ton of data out there in ESG reports. Look at that. The third thing I'd say is almost at an individual level, try and understand what your own footprint is. Like, and again, there can be really smart ways of doing it. There are real data driven ways of doing it. Or, just starting out, you can just start out at an overall level. The amount of waste that gets produced, the amount of flights that we take, the amount of car journeys that we take, the amount of food and other things that we source from, say, opposite side of the planet, for example, like all of those things. So again, there are some really good checklists, and I'm happy to share that with you. Maybe you can share that with your listeners as well. There are some really good checklists that we can use at an individual level, because I guess the first thing, and which is what you're touching upon, is information. People need to really understand this space. And so, which is like this global, look at it at a global level, look at it at a company level, look at it at an individual level. And the first thing is information. If you don't know what your impact is, there is no way you can reduce it. So it's great to research all that, but also take action at the end of the day.
I think, yeah, that's a very important point. So at global level, and then you're at on country level, at your company level, at your individual level, at every level, essentially, you kind of understand what is your footprint and what is the wastage that we're doing. Can it be managed? Even simple things like, wet and dry waste segregation, probably,
Exactly.
and all those things eventually help, right? Yeah, more than measurement is the action that is required. If you're cognizant about it, if you're responsible about it, you will find ways to do that, essentially, is what
Yeah.
I'm understanding.
Exactly. Every little helps. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So thanks, Sam. It's all very important. And I think at every level, if you are at responsible and kind of start taking small actions, there is this butterfly effect which will happen. And eventually, I think it will be positive. One last question, Sam, that I wanted to ask is like, what are the career opportunities in this domain of ESG, like for the youngsters and people who are still graduating and all, right? If they want to go deeper into this sustainability thing, what are some of the career opportunities that you see?
So first of all, this is a growing space. So there's going to be loads and loads and loads of career options that even now today are like significant career options in this space. So I just want to start out by saying this is a space that will offer you loads. So if you're looking to grow a career in this space, absolutely the right thing to do. And going forward, it's only going to increase. And then to sort of the types of roles and the types of career options in here. I mean, there's multiple, coming from a chemical engineering background, I can see that there's actually research. First of all, there's research, and then there's applied research sort of options in this space. There are technology related career options. So, for example, this space is massively data driven, right? Or the real thing in here is data, understanding data, putting data to good use, and then sort of measurement and so on. So you can think about, data science careers or, data related disciplines, careers in this space. There can be, pure technology. And by that, I mean, things like AI and other technologies in the space, because again, we need anything and everything that we can put to use to really understand and make ourselves better. There can be careers in legal in this space. I mean, there's through all that we've discussed, there is a regulatory legal sort of framework angle to all of that. There can be, I mean, I can just keep going on and on and on. But I think, like, in short, I can say that, this is a growing space. This space needs every single kind of skill that we can get. And the focus of this area, of this sort of space, is only going to increase as we make our way towards 2030 and 2040 and 2050, which is where, you can, as your listeners research, they will see that some companies have got some really key targets for 2030. Some have got to 2035, some have got to 2040, some have got for 2050. So the focus on this space is not going to decrease, it's only going to increase. So I would urge every single one of your listeners or folks who are considering a career in this space to absolutely go for it. And there is a whole wide range depending on what you like and what you're interested in.
Very interesting, Sam. So what I understand is there is huge amount of opportunities here because, as you mentioned, there is opportunities related to data mining, pattern. So all the software related opportunities are there. And I think I would like to, at this point, also mention all the entrepreneurs, right, who are trying to start new companies.
Oh,
Maybe they should
absolutely.
start focusing in this domain, kind of coming up with some cutting edge research for measurement, for decreasing the footprint of these carbon emissions. And of course, all the new people, as you mentioned, right, every skill will be required. There is a when you create a company, right? Marketing, sales, everything will be required here also. So all the opportunities do exist here, and that's very good to know.
Absolutely. And if I may just quickly add one thing, because you just sparked off a thought there, which is around startups. This domain needs all the innovation possible, right? I mean, this just needs some
Right.
doing things differently. So a
Okay.
real great space for innovation, especially coming from startups.
Sure. It's a very important point. Yeah, thanks that you mentioned it. I think at this point, I would also like to ask all the viewers and subscribers, like, what are the steps they generally take, or what are the things at which they would like more clarification in terms of ESG? And I can always route these questions to you. And any last words that you would like to mention, Sam, and then we can wrap up this discussion. I think it was a tremendous discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, I think super interesting. I think the way you've sort of probed and got the questions and the discussion going is amazing. So thanks for that as well. Parting thoughts from me is a couple of things. This needs focus at all levels, at an
Right.
individual level, at a company, organization level, at a national level, at a
Right.
global level. This area needs all the focus, needs the right conversations, need the right skills. So please get yourself involved at all these levels, not at one level, at all levels. Get yourself
Sure.
involved in them. It will take
Mm.
all of us to kind of get this right. And there is no other option. We don't have another option, right? This is
Right.
it. So let's just all pull
There
our
is no
weight in the
planet B.
same direction. There is no planet B. That's it.
Right. I think, Sam, people like you are kind of spearheading it. The amount of passion that you have put into this, if other people who are watching this will also feel very inspired by it. And to all the subscribers, do whatever you can to save the planet. It's in your own hands. Nobody else is going to help you. Thanks for watching. Do subscribe for many such amazing conversations lined up. Have a nice day and have a sustainable planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Pradeep.